What if the entire history of Western philosophy rested on a misunderstanding so profound that nobody noticed it for 25 centuries? What if the greatest thinkers, from Plato to Descartes, from Aristotle to Hegel, had all built their monumental systems on a foundation that was never actually examined? Martin Heidegger believed exactly that, and whether we agree with him or not, the force of this claim is impossible to ignore. Philosophy, as he saw it, had forgotten to explain the very thing it spent its life talking about, being. Heidegger is one of the most influential and most controversial philosophers of the 20th century. His political choices, his membership in the Nazi Party, cast a long shadow over his name. Many people consider this stain enough to dismiss him entirely. And certainly his political allegiance deserves criticism. But reducing his entire intellectual legacy to that one dimension risks missing why his work shook the philosophical landscape so violently. His thought remains a seismic event not because of his biography, but because of the radical clarity of his question. What does it mean to be? Not what are things, not what exists, not what properties do objects have. Heidegger asked something far more basic, almost childlike. What is being itself? Surprising as it sounds, no philosopher before him had explicitly answered this. They talked about being all the time, yes, but they treated it as if everyone already knew what the word meant. It was the ground they walked on, but never the terrain they studied. Heidegger thought this was a colossal oversight. He compared it to talking endlessly about life, while only describing animals and plants. You can multiply examples, dissect living organisms, classify species, but you still want to define what life itself is. For him, philosophy had made the same mistake with being. It studied beings, the world of things, objects, souls, substances, while ignoring the fundamental question that makes all others possible. What does this really mean? This is what Heidegger calls a covering over of the question. Layer after layer of theories, metaphysics, and conceptual architectures were built on top of an assumption so obvious that no one thought to examine it. Being became invisible through familiarity, like a tool used so often that you forget it's even in your hand. Heidegger's mission, in Being and Time, was to remove all those layers, dust off the forgotten question, and reveal the naked ground of existence, something he believed had been lost since antiquity. To him, the history of metaphysics was not wrong in its details, but misguided in its starting point. Plato's world of forms, Aristotle's categories, Descartes' thinking substance. These weren't answers to the question of being, but attempts to describe entities. They were attempts to define what exists, not the meaning of existence. And so, according to Heidegger, philosophy drifted for millennia without ever turning its attention to the real mystery. This is a provocation that opens his project, that the oldest question in philosophy is also the least explored. And to reawaken it, Heidegger believes we must begin not with abstract objects or distant metaphysical structures, but with the one being capable of asking the question at all, the human being, the only creature for whom being is a problem, the only creature that wonders why there is something rather than nothing. Heidegger wants us to look again at that seemingly simple word, to be, and notice how little we actually grasp it. He wants to pull philosophy back to its origin point, before theories, before systems, before definitions. Back to the raw, almost unsettling fact that we are here, existing, thrown into a world we did not choose, and try and make sense of what it means simply to be at all. Before we can understand what Heidegger discovered, we have to pause and untangle a confusion so subtle that it went unnoticed for centuries. It is a confusion between being and beings, between what it means to exist and the things that happen to exist. The distinction sounds abstract, perhaps even pedantic, but for Heidegger, it is the difference between looking at the night sky and assuming you've understood the universe because you've counted a few stars. Philosophers have always talked about beings, entities, objects, creatures, ideas. Plato mapped a realm of eternal forms. Aristotle categorized the world into substances and qualities. Descartes split reality into thinking and extended substances. Their projects differ, their conclusions diverge, but they share a silent assumption that the meaning of to be is obvious. They thought the verb is carried a single universal sense, a neutral container into which any object could be placed. But Heidegger argues that this confidence is misplaced. The verb to be is not a simple box. It is flexible, shifting, ambiguous. It behaves differently depending on the context in which we use it. Saying, "I am tired," she is French, or "the book is on the table" does not express the same kind of being. One sentence describes a passing mood, another an identity, another a spatial position. The same verb is holds within it different modes of existence, different ways of being in the world. When philosophers ignored this diversity, believing that to be had only one universal meaning, they flattened the landscape of existence. They took the most complex mystery available to thought and reduced it to a single, rigid definition. This, for Heidegger, is where the philosophical tradition went wrong, not in its logic, not in its ambition, but in its starting assumption. He illustrates this problem through a simple analogy. Imagine wanting to understand life. Suppose someone brings you a cat and declares, "Here, this is life." You respond, "No, that is a living thing, not life itself." They return with a flower. Again, you object, "Still not life, only something alive." You could repeat the process endlessly, fish, birds, trees, and still never capture the essence of life. You would have a collection of examples, not an understanding. Likewise, listing beings does not illuminate what it means to be. This is Heidegger's point. Philosophy has gathered countless examples of beings without ever defining the being that makes them intelligible. The entire tradition, he argues, took the most basic question, "What does it mean to be?" and quietly set aside, assuming everyone already knew the answer. But the consequences of this oversight are enormous. If you confuse being with beings, you end up analyzing objects as if their existence were uniform, as if stones, chairs, trees, and humans were all variations of the same basic mode of being. You miss the radical difference between the existence of an object and the existence of a human being. You miss the fact that humans experience their being, interpret it, worry about it, question it. No chair wonders what it means to be a chair. Heidegger wants to restore this lost depth. He wants us to recognize that existence is not a single, static fact, but a layered phenomenon with different dimensions. The being of a tool is not the being of a mountain. The being of a person is not the being of a table. These distinctions matter because they determine how reality reveals itself to us. This brings us to the next step in Heidegger's project, understanding the two principal modes of being he identifies, subsistence and availability. Philosophers before him saw only the first. Heidegger claims the second is even more fundamental. And this shift, subtle as it may seem, completely transforms the way we understand objects, ourselves, and the world we inhabit. Imagine entering your room without thinking. You drop your keys on the table. You open your laptop. You pull out a notebook. You switch on a lamp. None of these gestures feel philosophical. They're instinctive, almost invisible. And yet, for Heidegger, this ordinary choreography reveals something that centuries of metaphysics missed. Objects do not appear to us as detached, neutral things. We encounter them as useful, as ready, as extensions of our actions. Before they are objects, they are tools, instruments woven into our practical lives. This is why Heidegger insists on distinguishing two modes of being: the subsistence of a thing merely present in the world, and the availability of something ready to hand, something that functions within our activity. Philosophers, he argues, focus on the first mode. They imagine the world as a museum of objects resting quietly on display. But this is not how the world actually shows itself to us. When you pick up a hammer, you don't contemplate its color, its weight, or its chemical structure. You reach for the nail. Your attention flows through the hammer, into the work you're doing. The hammer withdraws. It becomes almost transparent. This transparency is crucial. A tool works precisely because it recedes. The moment it draws attention to itself, when the pen runs dry, when the screen freezes, when the hammer breaks, the tool stops being ready to hand and becomes merely a thing. Our smooth engagement stumbles, and suddenly we notice the object as an object. Think about the difference between typing effortlessly on your own keyboard and borrowing someone else's. Your familiar keyboard disappears under your fingers. The unfamiliar one demands your attention. It resists your flow. Heidegger would say, one is available, the other merely present. And this availability creates more than convenience. It creates a world, not the planet, not the cosmos, but what Heidegger calls a surrounding world. The network of all the equipment, habits, and meaningful contexts through which you move. Your desk, your mug, your favorite chair, your routines. These form a living environment of readiness, a structure of significance that shapes how you inhabit space. Walk into someone else's home, and you immediately feel the difference. Their objects are not yours. Their world is not yours. You become tentative, careful, observant, because nothing belongs to your network of familiarity. Take something as simple as a picnic blanket in the park. You don't look at it as a patch of fabric occupying space. You see it as part of an ongoing activity, a sign of lunch, conversation, relaxation. It refers to knives, sandwiches, cups, maybe music, maybe a group of friends just out of sight. One object points to others. Meaning radiates outward. The blanket is not an isolated thing. It is a node in a network. This is the heart of Heidegger's insight. The being of an object is not defined by what it is in itself, but by how it fits into the web of human activity. A stone may simply lie on the ground, but if you sit on it to rest, it momentarily becomes a seat. The tree may just be a tree, but if you use its shade, it becomes shelter. The world is constantly shifting between things and tools, depending on intentions that sweep through it. The transformation works both ways. A tool that fails becomes a mere object, empty, unusable, stripped of the purpose that once animated it. A broken pencil is no longer a writing instrument. It is just a cylindrical object waiting to be discarded. Heidegger goes further. Even the trash bin, in this sense, is an ultimate tool, a device for collecting objects that have lost their place in the working network. This movement between usefulness and mere presence creates a dynamic world, not a static inventory of entities, but a living environment shaped by human engagement. It dissolves the illusion of a purely objective reality standing apart from us. Instead, reality appears as something we collaborate with, something that emerges through our actions, intentions, and routines. For Heidegger, this practical intimacy with the world reveals something essential. We do not stand apart from reality. We are always already involved in it, entangled with tools, tasks, projects, and possibilities. The world is not over there. It is a field of meaning we inhabit with our hands, our habits, our gestures. A world that does not simply surround us, but one that works through us. Up to this point, everything has revolved around objects, tools, things, and the subtle ways they reveal themselves through our activities. But Heidegger insists that this is only preparation. The real investigation begins when we turn the question back onto the one being capable of asking it, the human being. Because if objects receive their meaning from our engagement with them, then who are we, the ones who engage? What kind of being must we be if the meaning of the world depends on our participation in it? Heidegger argues that humans cannot be understood as mere entities among other entities. A table, a tree, a mountain, these simply are. They stand there, present, indifferent, following the logic of physical existence. But a human being lives in a fundamentally different way. We do not simply occupy space. We interpret. We question. We anticipate. We worry. We struggle with the very fact that we exist at all. For this reason, Heidegger refuses to describe a human being using the traditional vocabulary of metaphysics, substances, essences, categories. Instead, he introduces an entirely new term, Dasein. Dasein literally means being there, a being whose defining feature is its openness to the world. It is not a biological creature with philosophical add-ons. It is a creature for whom being becomes an issue, a creature that does not merely live but understands its living, a being that stands out from its surroundings by being aware of them, invested in them, and shaped by them. Dasein is not a fixed essence. You cannot describe it the way you describe a chair or a planet. It is not something you capture through attributes. It is defined instead by its possibilities. A chair cannot decide to become a different chair. A tree cannot reinvent itself. But humans can alter their direction, abandon a path, choose another, sabotage themselves, transform themselves, build or destroy, or redirect the course of their existence. For Heidegger, this capacity to project oneself into possibilities is not an extra feature of human life. It is the very structure of human life. And this is why he rejects Descartes' definition of the human being as a thinking substance. Substance implies stability, identity, a core that stays the same. But human existence is not stable. It is fundamentally unsettled. To be human is to be perpetually ahead of oneself, imagining, planning, fearing, hoping. If you pause for a moment and observe your mind, you will notice that you are almost never simply here. You are thinking about later tonight, next week, next year, or about some version of yourself you wish you were or fear you may become. This constant movement toward the future is not a flaw in our nature. It is our nature. Heidegger calls this movement projection. Not projection in the psychological sense, but the existential one. The sense that we are always reaching forward, thrown ahead of ourselves toward possibilities. And those possibilities are not abstract. They shape everything we do. Choosing career, committing to a relationship, moving to a new city, deciding to quit something or begin something. These are not incidental details of our identity. They are the very means by which we construct ourselves. But projection also brings another dimension, concern or care. In everyday language, care sounds emotional. For Heidegger, it is structural. It names the fact that humans cannot be indifferent to their own being. We are always involved, always invested, always entangled in what we do and who we might become. Even when we appear apathetic, even when we claim not to care, the very act of withdrawing is a response to the burdens of possibility. Care is a heartbeat of existence, quiet, constant, unavoidable. This intertwining of projection and care leads to surprising insight. We are never simply isolated individuals. We are always caught within a meaningful world, connected to tasks, tools, people, and situations. Our identity does not float above the world. It emerges from our engagement with it. To exist is to participate. And this participation has a limit, a boundary that shapes everything we do, even when we try not to think about it. Human existence is stretched between what it already is and what it could be, between the weight of its past and the open horizon of its future. But that horizon is not infinite. It ends somewhere. And this endpoint, our own death, casts a shadow across all our possibilities. To understand a human being fully, Heidegger argues we must face what we spend much of our lives trying to avoid, our own finitude. There is a moment, brief, unwelcome, often pushed aside, when you suddenly remember that you will die. It might happen while waiting at a red light, or lying in bed unable to sleep, or staring at an aging photograph. The thought arrives without invitation, like a knock at the door from someone you hoped had forgotten your address. For Heidegger, this moment is not a psychological accident. It is the most revealing moment of human existence. It is the moment when Dacian encounters itself most clearly. Animals face danger, but they do not face death. They sense threats, flee predators, freeze at strange noises. But they do not live on a quiet, unwavering truth that one day they will cease to exist. Humans do. A person can sit in perfect safety and still feel dread. Not dread of an enemy, not dread of catastrophe, but dread of nothingness itself. The knowledge that no matter how many years one lives, no matter how many projects one builds, no matter how many memories one accumulates, everything is heading toward a single point, a point with no return. Heidegger calls this confrontation being toward death, not a morbid obsession, not a despairing fixation, but an essential structure of what it means to exist. Death is not a remote event waiting at the end of a long road. It is a constant presence shaping every step we take. It closes a horizon of possibilities, giving our life a finite shape. Without death, possibilities would be endless, and therefore meaningless. With death, every choice becomes decisive, because each one eliminates other paths we will never take. But most of the time, we refuse to live in the clarity of this insight. We prefer a softer, diluted version of mortality. We say things like, everyone dies someday. It sounds true, and it is, but Heidegger sees it as a subtle evasion. When we say everyone, the threat becomes anonymous. It belongs to the world in general, not to us in particular. Death becomes statistical, abstract, an impersonal event that happens to people. Not to me, not now, not in a way I can feel in my bones. This evasion forms what Heidegger calls the inauthentic mode of existence. Not fake, not hypocritical, simply a mode where we hide from the truth we cannot bear to face directly. We fill our lives with routines, noise, entertainment, social chatter, endless tasks. We bury ourselves in what he calls today the anonymous voice of society that tells us not to think too deeply, not to look too far ahead, not to disturb the fragile balance of daily living. To live inauthentically is not a moral failing. It is almost a survival strategy. Faced with the abyss, laughter, distraction, and routine save us from paralysis. But Heidegger insists that this numbing comfort comes at a cost. We lose touch with our own potential. We trade authenticity for safety. We walk through life half awake. And yet, there are moments when the facade cracks. A funeral, a diagnosis, a close call, a sudden silence in which everything familiar loses weight. In those moments, the world tilts. The everyday tools, tasks, and conversations no longer hold us. They slip away, revealing a deeper layer of existence, one where we stand face to face with our own finitude. This encounter is terrifying, yes, but also freeing, because in the realization that I will die, something else appears. The realization that my life is mine, not society's, not the vase, not the expectations that surround me. When death becomes personal, life becomes personal. The future stops being an abstract timeline and becomes a limited territory I must inhabit deliberately. Every possibility becomes sharp, weighty, urgent. And in that urgency, authentic existence becomes possible, not guaranteed, but possible. Being toward death is not about anticipating the moment of physical collapse. It is about awakening to the structure of our life, a structure defined by finitude, by responsibility, by unrepeatable choices. It transforms death from an external threat into an internal guide, not a doom, but a compass, not a punishment, but a revelation. The question is not whether we will die. We will. The question is whether we will allow the truth of our finitude to shape the way we live before that moment arrives. If Heidegger has led us through tools, worlds, projections, and death, it isn't to plunge us into despair. His aim is far more demanding, to show that existence is not something we possess, but something we must enact, not passively, not automatically, but through a constant willingness to face ourselves without disguise. And this willingness, fragile, rare, easily lost, is what he calls authenticity. Authenticity is not a lifestyle, not an attitude, not an aesthetic. It is a way in which Dacian retrieves itself from the noise of everyday life and steps into its own possibility. It happens when we stop drifting along the currents of they say, they do, one ought to, and everyone must. Society is full of such ready-made narratives, always ready to tell us who we should be, what counts as success, how to behave, what to avoid. These narratives offer comfort. They let us float through life without confronting the deeper question of who we are. But authenticity requires a rupture with this comfort, not a dramatic rebellion, not an act of isolation, but a quiet, decisive movement inward. It is the movement by which I recognize that my possibilities are mine, and that no one else can choose them for me. This recognition is never given freely. It is forced upon us by those rare, unsettling moments when the everyday structure of meaning collapses, when a tool breaks, when a habit becomes intolerable, when a relationship ends, when death reveals its nearness, or even when boredom stretches into a vision of emptiness. These moments are not interruptions of life. They are revelations. They open what Heidegger calls a clearing, a space in which being becomes visible, not as a theory, not as a concept, but as a raw fact that I am and I must become. In the clearing, the world is stripped of its comforting illusions. We no longer hide behind routines. We see the fragility of our choices, the finitude of our time, the weight of our freedom. But this clarity is temporary. The clearing closes quickly. Everyday life rushes back. The world fills again with obligations, emails, errands, conversations, noise. For Heidegger, the challenge is not to escape this world, but to remain capable of understanding it differently, to continue existing within it, yet without forgetting what the clearing revealed. This is why authenticity is not a stable state. It is a practice, a discipline, a rhythm. One oscillates between clarity and distraction, between awakening and forgetfulness. Authenticity means allowing the truth of one's finitude to inform one's choices, silently, deeply, continuously, even while dealing with the mundane details of life. It is not about turning away from the world, but about inhabiting it with sharpened awareness that every moment is shaped by the possibility of its own end. From this perspective, tasks, obligations, tools, work, relationships all regain significance, but a new kind of significance. They are no longer mere distractions, shielding us from ourselves. They become expressions of our chosen possibilities. A job becomes more than employment. It becomes a way of existing. A relationship becomes more than comfort. It becomes a site of responsibility. A project becomes more than ambition. It becomes a gesture toward the future we are constructing. The world remains the same, yet we move through it differently, more deliberately, more transparently, more vulnerably. Heidegger does not promise fulfillment or happiness. Such promises would contradict everything he has revealed. What he offers instead is a framework in which existence becomes a task we take up consciously, a task that is never complete, never assured, but always urgent, because the truth that haunts authenticity is also what empowers it. Our possibilities are finite, and it is precisely this limit that charges them with meaning. If we lived forever, nothing would matter, but we do not, and in that limit lies the strange dignity of human existence. A dignity rooted not in what we achieve, but in how we confront the horizon that defines us. Authenticity, then, is not the triumph of the self. It is the acceptance of its fragility. It is a recognition that living is not simply being alive. It is the courage to step into the clearing again and again, even as the world tries to close it. Not to escape death, but to let the truth of death illuminate the work of being alive.